In this tutorial, we will learn how to work with the 3D Titles pack in Premiere Pro. We'll go through the pack together and create both simple and complex titles through 3 different examples that vary in difficulty, showing you all that is possible with this pack. So, let's start with the first one and get familiar with the titles and their controls. In Premiere Composer, open up the 3D Titles folder and choose a title you like. I'll go with this one. Click the Add button to add this title to your timeline. You can use the sliders in the transform settings to control the rotation and position of the title, but we'll set all these to 0 for now. We will, however, need to change the scale to 75. Now, open up the text settings. And let's change the first text to Jesse Sterling, and the second one to Performer. Let's also change the font to Belly Display for the first text. For the second text, we'll just change the weight of the font to regular. While we are here, we can change the line distance, the text tracking of either the first text or the second. We can also turn off the outline. Due to this pack involving 3D, previewing your animation might be slower than usual. To improve the speed of previewing, you can change the playback resolution to 1/2, 1/4, or lower. And if that doesn't help, you can always pre-render a part of your sequence by marking an in point and an out point. After that, press Enter and wait until it's finished rendering. Or if the only thing you have in your sequence is one of the 3D titles, you can just press Enter without marking the points. Now that the title's ready, we can add in some footage to see how it works in action. I'll drag in a footage I prepared beforehand and preview it. Works great, but the colors don't really match our footage, so let's change that. Open up the color settings and start by changing the text one color. I'll go with a soft purple to fit in with my footage. For the second text color, let's make it red so there's a nice contrast going on. Last thing I have to do for this title is to reposition it slightly. Now we can add in some additional assets from our library to make it stand out a bit more. Click Browse and search for Multiple Glitter. Both of these look nice, so we'll start by importing the first one. Move it in the timeline by a few frames. Resize it to around 25 and reposition it above the Sterling text. Looks good. Let's add the other glitter animation as well. Click Browse and add the other animation to the timeline. Again, move it in the timeline by a few frames. Resize it and reposition it above our first Jesse text. Perfect. We now have a ready-to-use lower third text. Now that you have a lower third created, we can move on to something slightly more advanced. For this example, we'll be creating this 90s style title sequence. It might look a bit daunting, but it's surprisingly easy to create, so let's get started. In Premiere Composer, choose a title again and add it to the timeline. Let's start by changing the colors. We'll change the main color of the text to a nice orange, and the bevels color to darker red. Now we can change the text and the font. Let's also resize the text slightly. While we're here, turn off the outline. Great. Fits way more nicely. Now, I'll trim the beginning of the animation by a few frames and go to the animation settings. Turn off the out animation. Change the rotation speed to 0 and the zoom speed to 50. Since we turned off the out animation, we'll need to adjust the duration to match our footage length. We can reposition this title now so we make space for the other title underneath it. Let's also rotate it slightly on the X and the Y axis. Now onto the 3D options. Change the bevel size to 200 and the bevel outline to around 25. Looking good. Let's create the second title now. Duplicate our current title and reposition it so that it lines up with our first title. Change the text. And let's push both of these titles slightly to the sides so it's more visually appealing and they aren't just stacked on top of each other. Perfect. Since we have our main title finished now, we can move on to our smaller credit title. Click Browse and choose the one right next to the title we imported. Start by changing the text to Film by Quentin Horsatino. After that, change the font to Oswald Semibold. Change it for the second text as well. Now we'll want to center this title. Resize it down a bit as well, and reposition it so that it's placed under our main title. I'll fix the small gap between these two texts here, and let's turn off the outline as well. Let's change the colors now. Change both text colors to a red that matches our bevel color. The in animation seems a bit too fast, so let's lower it. In the animation settings, change the in animation speed to around 65. Turn off the out animation, and turn on the continuous animation. Here, change the rotation speed to 0 and the zoom speed to 50. Since we turned off the out animation, we'll need to adjust the title's duration to match our footage length. In the timeline, I'll trim this title by a few frames. Align it with the other titles, and move it by around 10 frames so there's a slight delay. And I'll adjust the duration one last time. The last thing I'll do is add a glow effect I made beforehand. I'll just paste it in on all titles real quick. And we're done. Looks stunning, as if this were a real title sequence from the late 90s. Let's move on to something a bit more complex now. In this example, we'll be creating an ad for a new coffee brand by our fictional in-house coffee brewery called Sweet Horse Bean. Since there's quite a bit to cover, we shouldn't waste any time, so let's get started. Once again, start by importing a title into the timeline. For this example, we'll use the one-line zoom title. The first thing we'll want to do is change the duration to match our footage length. Then, change the X rotation to 0. Now we can change the text to Blend Coffee, and the font to Cooper. I can already tell this text is too small, so let's scale it up a bit, and before we preview it, disable the outline. Looking good so far, so let's jump into the animation settings now. Start by turning off the continuous animation, and after that, turn off the out animation. In the in animation, decrease the speed by about half, and adjust the start value as well. We can preview it and see how it looks. I think I'll change the random seed so that the animation looks a bit different. Let's change it to 4 and preview it. It still doesn't feel right. Let's change it a bit more. Okay, this seems and feels way better, so let's keep it at 12. Now, I'll want to animate the title slightly so that it fits the tilting of the footage in the background. Before I do that, I'll disable the in animation so I can see how well I'm animating it. After that, open up the Effects Controls panel. Here, I'll go to the first frame and adjust the scale to around 120 and the rotation to around -20. I'll keyframe both the rotation and the scale, and move the playhead to around 2 seconds forward, and keyframe both back to their original values. I'll also ease all the keyframes. I set the rotation a bit too high, so let's change it to around -10, which might work better. Great. Now, go back to Premiere Composer and turn on the in animation again, and preview it. Looking really good so far. Now let's move this title to a video layer above and duplicate it to the layer below. For this new duplicated title, we'll want to change the Y position. You know what? Let's reposition the original title down a bit as well, and resize the new title somewhere between 40 and 50. We can now change the text to our fictional coffee brand's name, and let's change the font to Montserrat Medium. While we are here, we can also change the text tracking. The last thing we'll change is the color. Change it to a nice, smooth green. Perfect. Really liking how these titles have turned out. Now, for the finishing touches, we'll add in a slight blur to the sides of the titles. Start by nesting both of the titles. Duplicate this nest and place it on the layer above. Select this new nest, and in the Effects panel, search for Gaussian Blur and apply it to this nest. In the Effects controls, set the blurriness to around 30. And apply one more effect to this nest called Track Matte Key. Here, set the matte to an empty video layer above this nest. In my case, Video 4. Now, I'll import a pre-made animation that I'll use as a mask for the blur. This is how the mask looks on its own. We'll be applying our blur effect only to the dark values of this animation. Right now, the blur is being applied to only the white parts, which we don't want. So, go back to our nest layer with the Track Matte key, and click Reverse. Perfect, and we're done with our brand new coffee brand commercial. Now that you know how to think and create with an additional dimension, go out there and create something cool, and most importantly, 3-dimensional. Get this at MrHorse.com.